And now we are ready to begin. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Torn Book Club. Pardon me 1 second while I fix a couple things here. Okay, there we go. I am your host, Sarumann, aka Josh, and I apologize for the late start today. When I turned on my broadcasting software, it decided now was the perfect time to update the whole thing, and so I did. And so it began updating everything. It crashed. I had to restart it, and then make sure all the settings were correct again because all the settings had changed. So I apologize for the little delay in start, but now we're good to go, and we are recording. Yes, we are. Okay. I love when software decides now, while you're about to use me, is a perfect time to update. So, yeah. So, anyway, we are here today in, today's date is October 11th, 2015. And we are in horror month. And that means we are talking all things horror and spooky and scary. And so this week I decided to talk about none other than the master of horror himself, Stephen King. I don't know how many of you have read Stephen King books. How many of you like him, don't like him? If you do like him, I understand. If you don't like him, I understand that too. If you've never read him, believe me, I can sympathize. Just because his stuff can get pretty dark and pretty scary, especially his earlier works. But for me, I got onto the Stephen King bandwagon at what I guess would be a pretty early age for somebody to get into this. I was probably around maybe 13, 14, something like that, when I first read a Stephen King book. And that first book was Misery, which was a great way to start it. Because Misery is a very scary book, and it freaked the hell out of me. So that was sort of my introduction, and I became obsessed. Read everything I could get my hands on. Got everything out of the library. Temple saying there's so much more to him than just horror, though. He's written a lot of other fiction that isn't horror. And yes, that's very true, Temple. He has, and I'm going to get into that also later on. Because I think when Stephen King branches out from horror and does something else, he is truly spectacular. In most cases. There's one particular case where he wasn't really writing a horror story. He was writing something else, and I didn't like it. But anyway, so I started with Misery, and for those of you who may not know what Misery is, it's a story about an author who is finishing up his latest book, his latest manuscript, and on his way home from his traditional finish up the book in a cabin up in the woods, he's driving home and he gets hit by a big blizzard, and he gets into a car crash and is rescued by a woman who claims to be his number one fan. And so she begins to nurse him back to health, and he soon begins to realize that she is in fact very, very unstable, and has kidnapped him essentially and made him a prisoner in her home, and it's up to him to try to get out. And when King wrote this, he sort of described this as every author's worst nightmare. And I don't know if every author has had this weird nightmare of a fan being so obsessed that they will kidnap them and basically keep them drugged in their home and forcing them to write a book for them. I don't know, but but yeah, it was a truly scary book, and for me, what really scared me the most with it was one particular scene that's in the book, but not really in the movie. Um, the book is much gorier than the movie was. The movie is a fantastic movie, and it's the movie that introduced a lot of us to the actress Kathy Bates, who she had been doing a lot of she'd been a character actress for a long time, and she was somebody you sort of recognized but never in like a big way, and then they cast her as the villain in the movie, Annie Wilkes, and she won an Oscar for it and became well known forever from it. Um, but anyway, the scene in the book that really just sort of stuck with me and still sticks with me today is is a scene. Temple says, because as we all know, it's super easy to be creative when you're being forced to write by a crazy person. Oh yeah, yeah. Well, that's the only way I can write. It's the only way I get information. So it's the only way I get inspiration, I should say. So, any of you, if you want to see me write anything, kidnap me, drug me, and stick me in a basement, and I will turn out a great novel for you. That's a joke. Don't do that. Uh, so um Uh, so the scene that I'm referring to in Misery is after after a cop has come, sort of investigating the disappearance of the character of the writer. His name's Paul Sheldon. Um, a cop has come to Annie Wilkes' home, and she kills him. In Now in the movie, this only happens once, and it's very straightforward. She just shoots him with a shotgun. In the book, she stabs him to death with a giant cross and then runs over him with a riding lawnmower. And so, later on in the story, I can't remember if it's because somebody else is investigating or if this was a form of punishment that she was giving him, but she basically drugs Paul and throws him down in the basement. And while he's down in the basement, he's woozy. He's really not entirely in his own head, and he starts imagining the mutilated corpse of the dead cop crawling around in the basement trying to get to him. And that whole scene just freaked me out, because it was, the way he described it was just really intense, because Paul has at this point has had one of his feet chopped off. Again, that's the difference between the book and the movie. In the book, the famous scene in the movie is the hobbling scene, where she breaks Paul's ankles when she discovers that he's tried to get out. In the book, she doesn't break his ankles. She chops off one of his feet. And so he's down in the basement. He's been in a wheelchair. He can't move. He can't move his legs. His legs are broken. His foot is missing. All he can do is sort of crawl around on his arms, which he can't really do all that well because he's been drugged up. And this whole time he's imagining this mutilated dead body stalking him in the basement. And it freaked me out so bad, like it still stays with me. And I don't know, maybe I should reread it, because I have a feeling that that scene will probably not be as intense as I remember it. But when I was a kid, I mean, I read this when I was 13 years old, it just stuck with me. And it terrified me, and it fascinated me at the same time, that a writer could tap into like something so primordial and something so deeply unsettling. And I was like, I want to see if he can do this again. So I started reading more, and I started reading more and more and more and more. and pretty soon I was like, I was such a Stephen King fanatic in high school that my counselors were actually worried about me. My student the guidance counselors were actually kind of worried about me, because I was always carrying around a Stephen King book, and I was always reading a Stephen King book whenever I had any downtime. And so yeah, that got a couple of phone calls from the guidance counselor. But I ended up being an okay, well-adjusted individual. Aside from that, in spite of that, Suzanne may beg to differ. I see Suzanne in the chat. Hello, Suzanne. Uh, so so that was my introduction to Stephen King, and I started reading lots of other stuff, and I won't even say that Misery was like one of his best. It's really hard for me to really put like a best on a Stephen King book, because one of the things that people criticize Stephen King for, and I do agree with this, is that he tends to reuse a lot of the same tropes in his stories. And this is very true. And if anybody has ever watched another YouTube series, or is it on YouTube? They put it on YouTube. It's a web series called The Nostalgia Critic. Every October he will do a review of a Stephen King miniseries. So he would review a Stephen King miniseries, and one of the things that he did in his review of It was he talked about the Stephen King drinking game, which is take a drink if there's an abusive father, take a drink if the story takes place in Maine, take a drink if there is a supernatural creature that is never explained. And stuff like that. And you see a lot of that stuff in a lot of Stephen King's stories. And, for better or worse, like, it is, like, for me, when I was, like, really into my Stephen King phase, it was very much sort of like a comfort zone for me. Everybody's saying I'm back. I probably don't want to know what you were all about, do I? Well, that's up to you. You're welcome to rewatch the YouTube archive to find out what I was talking about. You may regret it, but you're welcome to it. So one of the books that I became really obsessed with in high school was It. And I don't know how many of you have read it. It's a long book. It's over 1,000 pages. But it's also a TV miniseries, and it's probably one of the more famous Stephen King TV miniseries. Came out in mid-90s. And it really scared a lot of people, mostly because of a character known as Pennywise, who is a demonic clown who has existed for 200 years and is sort of an extension of this weird supernatural creature that feeds on fear. And so, or it feeds on certain emotions, and one of the ways that it gets to trigger those emotions is by creating this projection of this clown that really taunts you and teases you and threatens you and stalks you. And in the miniseries, he's portrayed by Tim Curry, and it's one of his best performances in just about anything ever. But lots of people were terrified of Pennywise, and I sort of feel like this is where I mean, we've had fear of clowns for as long as there have been clowns, but I sort of feel like after the introduction of Pennywise, people suddenly felt more comfortable voicing how much clowns scare them, because now this was a scary clown who was supposed to be scary. And so people were like, "Oh man, I feel this way about every clown I see." And but it's another one of those things where, like, if you go back and you look at it now again, Pennywise is not really all that scary. Like, the effects are really kind of cheesy. I mean, it was mid '90s TV, when they didn't really have much in the way of budgets. So he has a lot of like pretty cheesy scare effects. Um, but I mean, what really sells him is just Tim Curry's complete dedication to this role, where he is goofy and silly in one moment and then is terrifying and just demonic in the next. I Stole the One Ring is saying my sister's friend is scared of clowns because of Pennywise, and yeah, that I'm sure that happens too. Um, but for me, I read the book cover to cover and became obsessed with it, um, and actually tried to get my friends together to shoot our own movie adaptation of it. And I Stole the One Ring saying, since I was older, I guess it didn't have that effect on us. We thought it was lame. Yeah. And what's Temple saying here? I'm totally indifferent to them. I've been watching the fourth season of American Horror Story and I'm a little bored. It's not just scary enough for me. The other seasons had moments of scare for me, but this one just makes me feel sad for everyone. Yeah, I actually gave up on this last season of American Horror Story probably about halfway through. Um, it really wasn't doing anything for me. Its most compelling episode, I think, was the episode about the backstory of the clown character, and then once that was done, like, it was never going to be addressed again. So I'm like, why am I even watching this now? So I stopped, and I don't regret stopping it. I heard it was not that. I heard it didn't pan out very well. I haven't watched this new season yet, although I've heard it's good. We'll see. I might give it another shot. Um, but anyway, with it, um, I got my friends together, wrote at least part of a screenplay for it, and started shooting it with like our home video camera, with just me and my friends, and it's so stupid. It was so dumb, but it was like the result was stupid, but doing it was a lot of fun. Uh, so yeah, now we're talking about American Horror Story. I don't want to get too much into American Horror Story because it has its up and downs for me. Like, there are some seasons that I think are pretty good, other seasons that I think are just really lame. Uh, but it's an anthology, so it's a different it's a different story every season. So you sort of have to you're sort of starting from scratch every season. But I kind of like that about it. Uh, but anyway, with it, they're talking about remaking it as a Hollywood horror movie now, which, for one, I don't think you can compress the story into a solid 2 hour movie. Second, apparently, the original director of the movie quit because the studio was insisting on the movie focusing primarily on jump scares. And and anybody who reads Stephen King knows that, or has seen it, you know that this story is not about jump scares. And Stephen King himself is really not about jump scares. He's very much about creating a creepy atmosphere and giving you a lot of history, and also introducing you to a lot of characters and telling you a lot about them so that you like really learn to sympathize with them and to care for them so that when they become threatened later on you actually do feel some intensity. um, there was one Stephen King book that I had never read, mostly because I had seen the movie first, and the movie scared me so badly. Again, I saw because it was a movie that I probably saw way, way too young. Um, yeah, Temple saying jump scares get old. You watch it once, it's scary, but the second time, you know it's going to happen, so it's no longer scary, like a good psychological scare. Exactly. That's why that's why I've never been into jump scares, because once you know where it happens, the effect is lost completely. It's good once. Like that's how I feel about like most jump scares and most satirical comedies, like the scary movie movies, stuff like that. They have laughs that are good maybe once because they're surprising. So yeah, when you're relying on surprise to be the crux of your laugh or your scare, um, what you're doing is you're also relying on it to be scary or to have that effect only once, because it's only ever going to have that effect once. And I would much rather I would much rather watch a movie or read a book that has a scary, creepy atmosphere that draws me in, so that I feel that every time. Because that's what you want. That, or at least that's what I want. I want something that has good replay value. And Stephen King, for the most part, does have really good replay value. So as I was saying, there was one book that he wrote that was adapted into a movie. I saw this movie way too young, and it scared me so bad that when I got into my Stephen King reading phase, my memory of the movie was so intense that I was like, I just can't read this book. I can't go back there. And so I never did until this past week. I finally read it, and that book is The Shining. Um, and it's one of King's classics, and it also has an interesting controversy around it, because the movie, which was done in the late 70s, I want to say 78, 77 maybe, um, was done by Stanley Kubrick, and is still to this day considered one of the horror masterpieces. But it's also a movie that Stephen King himself personally hates, um, because he felt that Kubrick did such a bad job interpreting and adapting the story. And so much so that later on in either the late 90s or the early 2000s, King um, wrote a wrote a three-part miniseries. King wrote a three-part miniseries that was supposed to be a more faithful adaptation to the book. And the miniseries is really not all that great. It's again, it suffers from uh, that time period of very quick turnarounds, low budgets, very cheesy effects. But one thing it does have in its favor is the main character, Jack Torrance, who was played by Jack Nicholson in the Kubrick version and played by Steven Weber in the new version. And Jack is he's a very complicated character, especially after having read the book now. And Jack Nicholson plays him very, very simply, very simplistically. He is just, and I really feel like this is probably also just from how Jack Nicholson was in the 70s, where like no matter what he did, no matter where he was, what he was doing, he always looked like he was on the verge of murdering somebody. Uh, and so even in his more tamer moments, or the moments in The Shining where he's supposed to be just Jack Torrance, and not uh, Jack Torrance, the father and the writer, he still looks like Jack. He still looks and acts like Jack Torrance, the alcoholic who is being possessed by the spirits in this hotel. And yeah, exactly what Temple is saying. Jack's psychological change was more developed in the miniseries, even though the miniseries wasn't as good. And I totally agree with that. And you really get like, and having now read the book, I can understand where Stephen King is coming from, because The Shining is very much a character study. I would say much more so than a horror, like a straight up horror story. I mean, it's got the haunted hotel. It's got various ghosts in there. It's got the really creepy scene with the woman in the bathtub. But it really spends a lot of time talking about the history of the Torrance family and why they are the way they are. Like how it talks a lot about Jack's alcoholism and how it took him. It took a series of events, starting with him going into a drunken rage and accidentally breaking his son's arm, to realize that things need to change. And so he goes into AA. He stops drinking, but he still feels that, and that's like one of the things that King talks about in the book that is depicted more in the miniseries and almost not at all in the movie, is just Jack's constant desire to have a drink, always lingering in the back of his head, and more often than not coming up as like extreme emotional outbursts that come from nowhere. So so what we have in The Shining, the book, is this strong progression, this very slow progression with Jack, he absolutely loves his son Danny, and Danny is really sort of the anchor point for him. He's the focal point for him, and he's the one who, whenever Jack thinks about Danny, that's what sort of brings him out of whatever dark place he might be in. And meanwhile, you have the ghosts in the Overlook Hotel that are going after Jack. They're tempting him with alcohol. They're tempting him with all sorts of things, and basically in order to take possession of him so that he can take Danny, because Danny has this incredibly intense psychic ability that they can then use to, I don't know, come out into the real world or something like that. It's never really explained why they wanted Danny's abilities and what they were hoping to use it for. Just that they wanted it, and they wanted Jack to be the instrument that gets it. So in the Kubrick movie, what we see is a lot of Jack just being, when he's not possessed by the hotel, he just seems very miserable. And in the miniseries and in the book, you have a lot of him interacting with Danny and trying to be a good father, and in most cases actually succeeding in being a good father, because Danny loves Jack, like more so than he probably loves his mother, and his mother is like always sort of the wife, Wendy. We get a lot of her history as well, and she is somebody who was so traumatized by that incident where he broke Danny's arm that she's always suspicious of Jack. Like, even though he has been on the wagon and he hasn't had a drink, he's always had a very short temper. So whenever that comes out, like, she immediately goes into, if you touch Danny, I will take him away from you. She's very defensive, and she's always ready to spring. She's ready to accuse Jack of harming Danny at a moment's notice, because she's basically waiting for that moment to happen. She's waiting for that moment when okay. They're talking about ads on Ustream. Okay. Yeah, weird. So where was I with Jack? So Wendy, she's always anticipating that moment when the other shoe drops and Jack goes back to doing what he did once. He only did once, and it and realizing what he did absolutely devastated him. Uh, and some could argue that that's unfair, but I think in the case of Wendy, like she's very protective of Danny, and so because it happened once, she now perceives that as a potential threat. And but she also believes in Jack, so she's constantly like going back and forth. Like she wants Jack to be a better person, but at the same time she's fearful of what he could be. And so like I would say like half the story is mostly about this very tense family dynamic, and how like Jack takes this job at the Overlook Hotel because he's been fired from his job as a English teacher at prep school because he got blindingly enraged at one student and started beating him up. And this was after he had stopped drinking. It just came out of nowhere. But he got fired for that, and one of his friends who's on the board of the school is also on the board for the Overlook Hotel, and he was able to bully them into taking Jack on as their off-season caretaker, just so that he had a job, he had some sort of income. Meanwhile, in the 6 months that he would be up in the Overlook, his friend would be back at the school, sort of greasing the wheels and talking people into taking him back. So, like, this whole thing was supposed to be just a temporary setback for him. Temple saying, I think that's what makes King so good at horror. He establishes characters with normal problems and struggles, then he turns those problems and struggles on their side, and that's where the horror comes in. Exactly. And that's definitely the case in The Shining. I would say it's also the case in another book, Needful Things. It usually is like a lot of normal people with normal lives. They have like some sort of issue, some sort of problem, but it's nothing nobody has ever had to deal with before. They're normal human struggles, but then you enter this supernatural element to it that then escalates that and changes it and makes it, rather than like a quirk of the personality, it makes it their entire being. And I think there's a lot to be said about why King does that, or like why something like that would speak to us in such a deep way, because it clearly does. Otherwise, Stephen King would not be the worldwide prolific, best-selling author that he is. Like it's now to the point where he can basically write anything. He could write like, yeah, basically anything, and it instantly becomes a number one bestseller. And I think that's sort of where like the cynicism from a lot of people comes in, where like he's so successful that it becomes like, oh well, he's just churning out the same thing over and over and over again, and it's true. Like you do see a lot of tropes in Stephen King's works that are very similar. For instance, a lot of his stories, particularly his stories between like from like the 70s to the 90s, a lot of them take place in a specific fictional town in Maine called Castle Rock. And a lot of weird things happen there, and also a lot of like normal stuff. Like some of the more famous, probably one of the more famous Castle Rock stories is actually a novella that he wrote called The Body, which was adapted into a movie called Stand By Me, which I don't know how many of you have seen. If you haven't seen it, it's a fantastic movie, and it's a fantastic story about four kids in this sleepy little Maine town in the 60s. Like I think it's like takes place in the early 60s. And one of them discovers a dead body of a kid who had been hit by a train. And he talks his friends into going out into the woods and following the train tracks to see this dead body, and it becomes this very intense coming of age story for all four of them. And there's nothing supernatural about it. There's nothing overly scary about it. It's really a story about these four kids bonding, talking about their struggles, talking about their lives, and really sort of growing up from being kids to being young adults by going on this journey. And I mean, the other big one that he wrote that was not a horror story in any way, that went on to become I won't say it was like a huge box office hit, but it's definitely become a cult hit over the years, is The Shawshank Redemption, which is based on a book or another novella that King wrote called Rita Hayworth in Shawshank Redemption. And Temple is mentioning the Green Mile, and I do want to talk about the Green Mile in a minute. And Shawshank is it's not a horror movie. It's about a guy who is wrongly convicted of the murder of his wife, who spends 20 years in prison. And it's all about how he works around within the system, and how he's able to help himself rise up in the ranks in the prison world while also helping his friends out at the same time. And while all this is happening, he spends 19 years very meticulously digging a tunnel out of the prison, so that when the day finally comes, he just up and leaves and vanishes completely. And it's a story about a friendship between him and one of the big men on campus in the prison, Red. And it's a fantastic story, and it's a great movie. If you haven't seen the movie, I highly recommend it. And that leads into The Green Mile, which was, if anything, a spiritual follow-up to The Shawshank Redemption. It was written by Stephen King. It was directed by Frank Darabont. Again, the same people who did Shawshank. I believe that's the case. Yes. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's the case. And The Green Mile has more supernatural elements to it, but not in a scary way. It, it's about a death row wing at this one prison, and it's mostly about the warden and this one inmate who comes in who was again falsely convicted of a murder. But this man, he's a very simple man, but he also has this incredible supernatural ability to remove people's infirmities or sicknesses or anything that is wrong with them. He can remove it from them in this very bizarre supernatural way. And and it's about him bonding with the guards to the point where the guards actually break him out of prison in order to take him to the warden's home so that he can cure the warden's wife of brain cancer, which he then does. But in the end, they have to stick to the letter of the law, which means when the time comes, these people who have grown to know this man and have grown to love him and respect him and be in awe of him and what he can do, they also are required by law to kill him. And so it's this very it's an emotional, I won't say roller coaster, but it's definitely like it's a very emotional story. It's a very heartbreaking story. Um, and One of the things that I found so interesting about the Green Mile itself, and I don't know how many of you remember this because this was back when it first came out as a book. Every now and then, Stephen King will do some sort of publicity stunt or some sort of publishing gimmick to try to boost readership or um, to try to help publicize the story. Um, and with the Green Mile, what he did was he actually serialized it and put the entire book out in 6 installments that came out like once a month, once every 2 months, something like that. And so basically you had to go to the bookstore and buy a new Green Mile every month for the better part of a year to get the full story. And I was still I was sort of coming down off of my hardcore Stephen King phase back then, but this I thought was such a cool idea that I just really got into it and went to the bookstore every month or every 2 months whenever the new Green Mile installment would come out, and I would get it. And ultimately it was 6 installments that made up the whole book. And I know that it was a gimmick. I know that it was a publicity stunt. There was no reason for him to serialize it other than for it to be unique and something that people would talk about. And you know what? I bought it hook, line, and sinker. I completely fell for it, and I don't regret a minute of it. Um, uh, I stole the one where he was asking, what book are we discussing now? I'm discussing The Green Mile. Uh, so, yeah, I don't know how many of you remember um, that bit um, that the Green Mile was initially released that way, but like I thought it was really cool, and like he will do stuff like that every now and then. Like there was and Temple saying the gimmick doesn't matter if the result is good, and I think that's ultimately what it was the Green Mile was a good story, and so I didn't mind going to the bookstore every few weeks to buy another edition of what is essentially just more of the same book. Um, and my only regret is that I don't think I have those anymore. I don't think I have the Green Mile broken up into its 6 parts anymore. Um, but another one they did was there was a book he put out It was probably early 2000s. It was called The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon, um, which is a very simple story, but a very frightening one because it's about a girl probably like 8 or 9. Uh, and Temple saying, I think they only sell it as one book now, and she's talking about the Green Mile, and yeah, it's only sold as one edition now. Yeah, the only way you could have gotten the original 6-part version is if you had bought it when it initially came out. Um, but anyway, The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon was about this girl. She's probably like 8 or 9 years old, and she goes out hiking with her dad, and they they get split up. She wanders off and she can't find him, and she ends up getting lost in the woods. And it's this very psychological horror story about her trying to find her way out of the woods while she's being stalked by a bear. And you sort of like see like her own like a young girl's descent into madness, because like the more she's trying to find her way out, the more lost she is getting. um I won't spoil the ending, but I won't spoil all the ending for you, except to say that it has a happy ending. um but One of the things that Stephen King did later on, after that book came out, was he then released a pop-up book version of that story, which I don't know if that can be found anymore. But I remember seeing it in the bookstore and thinking, "Wow, a Stephen King pop-up. That's not something you see every day." Uh, so so another one of Stephen King books that I read and was obsessed with for a long time, and this was pretty much his magnum opus, is the Dark Tower series, which is a very bizarre, kind of fantasy-ish series. Um, it's a it's essentially about this guy Roland, who and Temple saying a happy ending or a Stephen King happy ending, which isn't just an end, which just isn't an ending where everyone is dead and or traumatized. Yeah. Um, yeah, the Stephen to say that the girl comes out totally unscathed would be incorrect. Um, but she does live, and and it's the same thing with the ending of The Shining, where um, Danny and Wendy and the cook, Dick Halloran, all survive. What is essentially like a way more intense ending than what we see in the Stanley Kubrick movie, where it's basically just Jack going nuts, chasing after Wendy and Danny with an axe, and eventually getting lost in a hedge maze and freezing to death. Um, in the book, Jack is taken over by the spirits of the hotel, and meanwhile, Danny has been psychically calling out to a friend of his, Dick Halloran, who can hear him, and travels from Florida up to Colorado to try to get to them, and Jack is completely possessed. Meanwhile, and like he's possessed to the point where he actually starts to physically transform. Um, and the whole story has this thing which a lot of people would refer to as Chekhov's gun, which, for those of you who are not familiar with what that means, it's a phrase. It was a writing trope that Chekhov talked about, which is, if you introduce a gun in the first act, it had better go off by the third act. which is basically saying like everything you introduce has to have a reason for being there. Um, and so in the beginning of the story, Jack is introduced to the boiler for the furnace for the hotel, which is this really old, rickety, clunky thing that is basically way older than it is. It has no reason to be in use because it is so old and is so damaged. Um, and one of the things that it does is it builds up pressure. And since it is so old and it is so busted, it has no safety. It has no automatic safety release valve. So a couple of times every day, Jack has to go down into the basement and manually release the pressure in order to keep the boiler from exploding and destroying the hotel. So, of course, as the story progresses and as Jack becomes possessed by the hotel or by the spirits in the hotel, he becomes so obsessed with going after Danny. I Stole the One Ring is asking, is Cujo a Stephen King book or not? It is, and there is a special connection between me and that I will get to in a minute. So in The Shining, you have this boy. He's become so. Jack and the spirits have become so obsessed with getting Danny that they'd forgotten about this. About the boiler. And so it's only when they finally have Danny cornered that Danny finally points out, "You forgot to reset the boiler today." At which point, Jack and everybody in the hotel starts freaking out. They run down, and the boiler is really past the point of no return, and it explodes, and it destroys the hotel, and Jack with it. And Wendy and Danny and Dick are able to get out in time. So it's a very different ending, but then it has an epilogue. It has an epilogue where the what was I gonna say? Where we see Wendy and Danny later on, maybe that year, and they're in a hotel up in Maine, of course, and Dick is the head chef there. And it's basically like Wendy is in a back brace because she was beaten up by Jack so badly that she actually has spinal injuries. Danny is very traumatized. He misses his father, and he doesn't want to. He realizes that he's growing up way too fast, and he has this conversation with Dick, where Dick tells him, like, every now and then you're going to feel like you need to cry, and what you need to do is you need to find a corner and you need to cry it out, and then you need to move on because you have to. And it's like this very sad, sort of depressing epilogue where it's like, yeah, your life is forever changed and you're never going to be happy ever again. Yeah, that was not a pleasant way to end that story. So so the connection that I have with Cujo is actually a very weird one, which I may have talked about on this show before. I've certainly talked to some of my friends about this. Back when I was a little kid, when we're talking like 5 or 6, I was a child actor, and child actor slash model for catalogs, and I still have a lot of those catalog pages of me in like cute little onesies and little Oshkosh Bagosh suspender overalls, like, yeah. And so and I was in a couple TV commercials, a couple TV specials. I was actually in one with Vincent Price when I was a little too young to really recognize him, sadly. But around the time they were starting to make Cujo, And uh, the story of Cujo is about a mother and her son who are in who are trapped in a broken down car that is being stalked by this giant Saint Bernard dog that is both rabid and also, at least in the book, possessed by an evil spirit. And so the main function of the story is that the mother and the son trapped in this car, and I was the original kid they wanted for that movie. And I ended up not taking it because at the time I was too deathly afraid of dogs, that there was no way I could have done it, and there was no way that my mom or my agent would allow me to be in a situation that would traumatize me so much. So unfortunately, that was I sort of missed my train to fame there. But I don't regret it because I'm pretty sure like it probably would have traumatized me because I really was terrified of dogs at that point in my life. And I think Stole the One Ring was saying I didn't realize Pet Sematary was also Stephen King. Yes, it was. And Temple saying, okay, a funny. As Josh is talking about Cujo, I got a dog food commercial. Awesome. So, yeah, Pet Sematary is also Stephen King. There's also Christine, the book about the possessed car. Carrie. And Carrie was actually his first novel. And so I was going to talk about The Dark Tower after we got distracted here. The Dark Tower was a 7-book series that it took Stephen King probably about 20 years or so, maybe 30 years to finally finish. And it was a story about this character named Roland, who is a gunslinger who is chasing after a man dressed in all black, and he's chasing him through this vast wasteland. Uh, and the man in black is heading towards this thing called the Dark Tower, and Roland is trying to either beat him to it or to stop him from getting to it. And so then we have this huge 7-book series about his adventures chasing this man in black. And it starts off really cool, and it's very bizarre because like he goes through various doorways that take him into our world, where he then becomes friends with a criminal kid and a girl and a woman in a wheelchair, and he brings them into our world. They go through this deserted wasteland town where the only thing that's running is a train that is run by computer, and the AI on the train has basically gone crazy and and wants to have a riddle game with people. So they go onto the train, and the train basically aims for a drop off and starts giving them riddles and says, you need to solve my riddles, otherwise we all die. And that's where the 3rd book ends. And then we had to wait probably a good 10 years or so for the next installment that resolved that cliffhanger. And then when we got it, it was a very quick resolution, and then the book went into a huge flashback into Roland's young life. And then after that, it was almost another 10 years before we got the next book. And then after that, the last three books in the series came out in fairly rapid succession. And I don't feel like the ending was as good as it could have been. Like, it's sort of, the last three books felt very rushed to me. And it gets very weird and very existential to the point where Stephen King himself becomes a character in this story. And you can sort of see, like, in the time between the fourth and fifth book, there was an incident in Stephen King's life which got fairly highly publicized. He was hit by a car, and very seriously injured. And he was he was seriously injured, and he had to go through a lot of recovery after that. And you can sort of see, like, after he got out of that, like, a lot of what he was writing started to change. And you could see, like, especially in the Dark Tower series, that he was sort of working through a lot of his own personal psychological stuff in when he wrote himself in as a character into the Dark Tower series. Ultimately, I felt the ending was not good, and that's always been my criticism of Stephen King, is that most of his stories, I would say, through the course of his stories, very rarely do they have a very satisfying ending. Like, usually there is, like, some sort of Deus Ex Machina that happens. Like, even, like, in The Stand, it's actually quite literal, with, like, a literal hand of God coming down and stopping things or fixing things. So yeah, the Dark Tower series was a real disappointment for me. Uh, but I know other people who love it, and I totally respect that. I totally understand that. For me, it didn't really work. I didn't care for how it ultimately panned out. Um, and I sort of feel like that can be said for a lot of Stephen King's works. Like, Needful Things, I felt, had a very bizarre ending. Um, yeah, The Shining has a bizarre ending with, like, with the hotel being destroyed, and, like, I don't know, like, is that some, like, for some reason the ghosts themselves are freaked out by the hotel being destroyed, when, like, why should that matter to them? Oh, Temple saying here, I think it's generally pretty hard to end a horror story. You either do a happy ending, which doesn't always work, or an ending where nothing is completely resolved and the monster is still alive to haunt again. And that's true. Um, like, I think in most cases, most horror stories do sort of end that way. But for some reason with Stephen King, it always feels like it's more of it's almost an emotional letdown, because it doesn't. You don't really feel that the characters have emotionally gone full circle. At least in Stephen King's early works, I feel like he's gotten a much better handle on that lately. One book that he recently put out, which I just absolutely loved, was this book called Joyland, um, which I don't think came out to, like, a huge amount of publicity. But the basic story for Joyland is it's about a kid who takes a summer job working at an amusement park, or maybe it's a fall job. It's like, yeah, he's taking a temporary seasonal job at a beachfront amusement park called Joyland, of course. And there is a there's a story of there's a story in the amusement park about their old spook house is actually haunted by a girl who died there, or a girl who was murdered there. And it's very much a coming of age story, but it's also a supernatural, almost murder mystery where he's trying to figure out what happened in that spook house. How did the girl die? Can he help release her spirit by solving this murder? And learning some of the darker secrets of the amusement park at the same time. But this one I felt had a really good character arc in it, like to the point where like the ending like actually made me emotional to the point where I almost started crying. So what's Temple saying here? It's almost like he's into the journey of writing the story, that once he reaches the end, he just can't end it very well. Maybe he doesn't want it to end. Maybe that's why he writes so much. That's an interesting idea, Temple. I hadn't really thought of it that way, but yeah, like, and I know that he's written some autobiographical stuff where he talks about his writing process. And I will confess I haven't read those yet. I know he's written one called Danse Macabre, and another one that's just called On Writing. And I haven't really read either of those. I'd be curious to read them. Just because, like, as prolific as Stephen King is, I don't feel that his work is ever hacky. And I know that there will probably be some people who would like lump him in with people like Dan Brown or John Grisham or James Patterson, people who basically write the same thing over and over and over again with such a almost mechanically in order to generate profits. But I don't feel like well, first of all, I don't feel like any of those writers are. I don't think it's a fair accusation for any of those writers. Another is I don't feel that Stephen King falls into any sort of category like that. I don't feel like Stephen King is a hack in any way. Like, he's definitely had really great stories. He's had others that were not so great. Uh-huh. What is Suzanne saying? What Barry complains about is when King goes into an extreme backstory of a character who ends up dying ignominiously in no time. Yeah, that's certainly the case, and I think that happens the most in stories like Stand. And Temple saying, I think King has done enough that's different that he hasn't resorted to rehashing the same plots completely. No, he hasn't. I feel like just about everything he's written has its own unique quality to it, even though a lot of them do share many of the same tropes. But that's sort of like that's your comfort zone. That's what you know. And I sort of feel like The Stand does a lot of really getting into a character's backstory and then killing him quickly. But that's sort of how it goes. Like with Stephen King, like, and particularly with The Stand, because The Stand is it's a post-apocalyptic story. And if there was anyone that I would consider to be my favorite, it would probably be The Stand. and that's because it takes so much time, and it really gets into this post-apocalyptic world and this sudden battle between good and evil that's going on. And like I really enjoyed like the characters' journeys, the establishments of the new societies, the ultimate battle between the two of them, and again, the climax of it really felt underwhelming, considering all the build up to it that had going on. And that's another one that was adapted into a miniseries that I think is a very strong miniseries. If you've ever seen it, it's a four-parter. I believe it's a four-parter, starring Gary Sinise, Rob Lowe, Molly Ringwald. It's got a very good cast, and does a really good job of sort of depicting this whole new universe in what was still a time when TV miniseries were not getting a lot of budgetary love. Uh, but yeah, I think of all of Stephen King's books, or at least of all the ones that I've read, which I admit are quite a lot, I would say The Stand is probably the one that is my favorite, my personal favorite. Uh, yeah, I think we'll end it with that. And yeah, Stephen King is he's good. If you haven't read his stuff, I highly recommend it. If you're not into horror, there is still stuff that he's written that you can get into. The Green Mile, Shawshank Redemption, to a certain extent, The Dark Tower. Uh, but yeah, Stephen King he's a very prolific writer. I would argue that he's a very talented writer. Um, I enjoy his work. Clearly, there are lots of people who do. Otherwise, he wouldn't be the bestseller that he is. Um, Even though I'm not the rabid obsessive fan that I was when I was a teenager. I still appreciate his work for what it is, and for what it was, and for what it meant to me, and to a certain extent what it still means to me. Um, Thank you, Aravandi, I Stole the One Ring, Suzanne, and Temple, uh, for being part of this conversation today. Uh, and I will see you all next week for something. I don't know what. Maybe some ghost stories or something like that. I don't know. We'll figure it out. Uh, yeah, thank you so much. And remember, our book of the month is 14 by Peter Clines, when we will be discussing that one on November 1st. I will see you all next week. Everybody have a great week, and never stop reading.